70 years of silence, 70 years of service, and 70 years spent holding both a family and a nation together through every imaginable crisis. Yet, in the final chapter of that extraordinary reign, when everything should have felt like a celebration, cracks reportedly began forming from within. Behind the walls of Windsor Castle, far away from cameras and cheering crowds, Queen Elizabeth II was said to be carrying a deep sense of sorrow. She had witnessed the British Empire shrink over decades and had seen prime minister after prime minister come and go. But according to reports, the decisions made by her own grandson, Prince Harry, and his wife Meghan Markle left behind a disappointment she would carry for the rest of her life. One remark attributed to her summed it up with striking bluntness. Harry had walked away from a lifetime of duty and history. For what exactly? To become a carer for Archie. Coming from a woman who had devoted every part of herself to the crown, those words carried undeniable significance. In her eyes, the Hollywood dream looked fragile, almost like a carefully stacked house of cards. And once you step outside the shield of the monarchy, the world no longer treats you kindly. To understand why this struck her as such a profound betrayal, you have to go back to the events that shaped everything she believed. Her father, George VI, never wished to be king. Quiet and burdened by a severe stutter, he found himself forced into the role after his brother, Edward VIII, chose love over duty and stepped away from the throne for the woman he wanted to marry. That choice almost tore the monarchy apart. George VI suddenly had to shoulder responsibilities he had never prepared for and never asked to carry. The pressure was immense. And ultimately, many believed that burden took a devastating toll on him. For the Queen, stepping away was never just a personal decision. In her eyes, it represented a betrayal of the sacrifice her father had died preserving. So when Harry left, he wasn't simply resigning from a role. From her perspective, he was turning away from the very loss that had placed her on the throne. For years, people have repeated the story that Prince William was the one with doubts about Meghan. But that version leaves out perhaps the most important perspective of all. The Queen herself reportedly advised Harry to wait an entire year before proposing, wanting him to fully understand what becoming part of the firm truly meant. King Charles, still Prince of Wales at the time, had reportedly offered the same warning, repeating advice once given to him by Lord Mountbatten. Enjoy the relationship, but think very carefully before making it permanent. Among older members of the royal family, Meghan was said to have quietly earned a nickname. Prince Philip, never someone known for filtering his thoughts, reportedly referred to her simply as the American. It wasn't meant as a comment on geography. It was a suggestion that the mindset of celebrity culture and the sacrificial nature of royal life were worlds apart and unlikely to blend. As the relationship moved faster, private concerns gradually turned into more direct tensions. One event from that period has rarely received the attention many believe it deserved: Meghan's reported confrontation with gardening staff at Windsor. Royal staff aren't viewed as ordinary employees. Many come from families that have served the crown across generations, and the Queen treated that loyalty with deep respect. When reports reached her that Meghan had allegedly spoken harshly to an undergardener and the head gardener, the response reportedly wasn't handled through notes or intermediaries. The Queen is said to have gotten into her own car, driven to the couple's residence herself, and spoken directly to the Duchess. The message was simple and unmistakable. In this family, staff are not treated that way. In that moment, two completely different worldviews appeared to collide. One woman who saw herself as a global celebrity, and another who had spent her entire life defining herself as a servant to her people. And from that point forward, the distance between them seemed destined to grow. What followed began to feel, both inside palace walls and to much of the public, like a slow dismantling of royal tradition piece by piece. Archie's birth should have become a moment of national celebration. Instead, it arrived surrounded by a level of secrecy many people described as deeply frustrating. There had always been an unspoken agreement between the monarchy and the public. The nation supports the palaces, the security, and the institution itself. In return, major milestones are shared. But the Sussexes chose a different path. Reports suggested the labor announcement came only after Archie had already been born, and even the identities of the godparents remained private. What many expected to be a national event suddenly felt more like a closely guarded Hollywood secret. For many members of the public, that became a turning point. It was the moment they concluded Harry and Meghan no longer wanted to be part of the national family. Instead, they appeared to be creating something different, a brand. And brands don't operate under obligations to the people watching. As the couple moved closer to their final departure, the world itself entered the chaos of a global pandemic. The royal family gathered at Windsor Castle in what became known as HMS Bubble. At the time, the public had no idea, and it would remain hidden for years, that Prince Philip had been fighting pancreatic cancer, a private battle he had reportedly been facing for 8 years. By early 2021, doctors had nearly lost him on 2 separate occasions, only days before the Oprah Winfrey interview was scheduled to air. As Philip remained in a hospital bed fighting to hold on, the Queen was navigating a world gripped by crisis. And thousands of miles away in California, her grandson was preparing to sit in front of cameras and describe the royal family as detached and uncaring. For many royal historians, the decision to move forward with that interview while Philip was so close to death became something that would never truly be forgiven. Not necessarily because of the claims themselves, but because of the timing and what that timing seemed to reveal about priorities. The interview brought attention to serious subjects like race and mental health. But inside palace walls, many felt the way those issues were presented resembled something much darker, a public settling of scores dressed as something else. When the Queen eventually released her now famous "Recollections May Vary" statement, most observers saw it as carefully measured public wording, masking a far sharper private feeling. The truth, in her view, had been bent out of shape, and she knew it. The strain of those months didn't only exist in newspaper headlines. It began showing itself physically through the Queen's visible decline. During the final year of her life, trust had deteriorated so completely that a new protocol quietly emerged, one that revealed just how far the relationship had collapsed. The Queen would no longer speak with Harry privately over the phone. A lady-in-waiting now had to be present for every conversation. The fear that personal remarks could somehow find their way into recordings, memoirs, documentaries, or future projects had become impossible to dismiss. Whenever a California number appeared on the switchboard, affection reportedly gave way to caution. The relationship no longer functioned on trust or closeness. It functioned on protection. In many ways, the palace had transformed into a fortress not against outside enemies, but against people within its own family. At the same time the Sussex situation unfolded, another storm was gathering around Prince Andrew. And this was where the Queen's responsibilities as monarch collided directly with her instincts as a mother. To the public, Andrew had become deeply controversial following serious allegations surrounding him. But to the Queen, he was something very different. He was the son she had actually been able to spend time raising. By the time Andrew was born, she had settled more comfortably into her role and experienced moments of motherhood she had largely missed with Charles and Anne. He became the child who would jokingly ask photographers if they needed more pictures. She reportedly never believed he had committed a crime, and standing by him was not a decision she intended to negotiate away. That support became visible to the world during Philip's memorial service, when she selected Andrew to escort her to her seat. It was a quiet gesture, yet the message felt unmistakable. This is my son, and I stand beside him. Courtiers had advised against it. Charles and William had reportedly made their positions clear. But by that stage, the Queen felt as though everything around her was slipping away. She had lost her husband, her health was declining, and her relationship with Harry had fractured. Standing by Andrew became, in many ways, her final act of resistance as a mother. She understood she was standing alone in that decision, and she chose it anyway. The combined weight of everything, the conflict with the Sussexes, the Andrew controversy, and Philip's death appeared to leave marks on her health that those around her struggled to separate from the immense pressure she carried. Stress is not some invisible force, especially not for someone in their 90s. And many people close to the royal family who watched the Queen's final decline have drawn connections between that burden and what they witnessed firsthand. The same conversation now follows Catherine's recent cancer diagnosis. Carrying the responsibility of holding the monarchy together while facing pressure from every direction is not a burden anyone wears lightly. When Harry and Meghan stepped away, they didn't simply remove two individuals from royal duties. The responsibilities they left behind shifted almost entirely onto William and Catherine. And the consequences of that shift may still be unfolding. In her final days at Balmoral, the Queen looked back on 70 years of reign, carrying both pride and a sadness she could never fully put aside. The Platinum Jubilee had finally arrived, but the peaceful future she had hoped to reach was overshadowed by a family fractured around her. 7 decades spent turning the monarchy into a symbol of continuity and stability. And in return, she watched events unfold like a family drama, playing out in real time across social media. What she reportedly found hardest to forgive was not the decision to leave itself. It was the way it happened, the feeling that these departures struck at the institution she loved during moments when it was already vulnerable. She died believing that the young prince she once watched grow up had exchanged 1,000 years of history for a brief moment of California celebrity. The effects of those final years are now woven directly into the monarchy King Charles leads today. Stricter rules around privacy, witnesses during phone conversations, a smaller working royal family. Much of it traces back to the turbulence of the Sussex years. The concerns the Queen once voiced concerns, many dismissed as the worries of an older generation resisting change, ultimately appeared to unfold almost exactly as she feared. The Hollywood excitement faded. The memoir arrived, and the divide remained. The question still hanging over everything is one only time can answer. Was stepping away truly worth the cost of losing the family's strongest protector? Her story is often remembered as one of triumph, and that version isn't inaccurate, but it leaves out the sorrow that shaped her final years. A grandmother who, perhaps too late, came to realize she could no longer shield her family from the consequences of their own choices. The monarchy she left behind stood in a more vulnerable position than at any point in the last century. Yet, even then, she left behind something else, a blueprint for survival. Even during moments when her own grandson was reportedly recording conversations for possible future use, even while her favored son had become a figure of public controversy, even as the end drew closer and she faced much of it in isolation, she continued to show up. She continued putting on the crown. She drove herself down to the garden to correct a situation personally, because to her, the crown was never an ornament, it was a commitment. And Queen Elizabeth II honored that commitment every day she lived. Now the dust of the Elizabethan era is beginning to settle, and what remains is a king confronting health struggles of his own, while the Prince and Princess of Wales face a level of scrutiny previous generations never experienced. Across the Atlantic, California's shadow still stretches long, and recollections, as ever, continue to vary depending on who tells the story. But one thing can no longer be rewritten: the distress the Queen experienced in her final years. That now belongs to history itself. She passed away exactly as she had lived, with her head held high, even while carrying profound grief beneath the surface. And perhaps that ability to remain composed under extraordinary pressure reveals more about her character than anything else ever could. The silence coming from the palace today carries a different feeling than before. Less ceremonial, more defensive, it feels like the silence of a family trying to rediscover stability after losing its footing. Whether a family can truly recover after trust has been damaged so deeply remains a question the palace is still wrestling with. Long before the end, the Queen had reportedly reached a difficult conclusion. Harry could no longer remain part of the inner core. Much of her final period on the throne involved quietly preparing for a future built around that reality. Watching King Charles navigate the opening years of his reign, you can already see that preparation unfolding. An approach that places the institution ahead of any individual, no matter who they are. For a family that has survived for 1,000 years, that calculation isn't viewed as cruelty. It is the logic that has allowed them to endure. What emerged from those final years was a monarchy noticeably more cautious, more structured, and more guarded than the version briefly shaken during the Sussex era. People inside palace walls described discovering a kind of calm now, the sort of peace the Queen herself never entirely reached before the end. The man who once held the title of Captain General of the Royal Marines, a role inherited directly from Prince Philip, eventually appeared barefoot beneath a tree during a carefully staged California photo shoot. And for many, that image became a symbol of everything that had troubled the Queen about Harry's chosen path. A man once positioned as a warrior for the crown had transformed into a figure inside a scripted lifestyle narrative, trying to keep the identity of a prince while setting aside the responsibilities attached to it. She understood that balancing act could never last. And the caution inside the palace didn't stop with phone calls or military titles. It eventually extended to visits involving Archie and Lilibet as well. And this is where the story becomes especially painful. Reports suggest that during those visits, the Queen requested her lady-in-waiting remain present throughout, not merely for conversation. Senior palace officials reportedly feared that private moments involving the Queen and her great-grandchildren could potentially be photographed and later used for commercial purposes, Netflix projects, or wider branding efforts. A great-grandmother who simply wanted time with her family suddenly found even those ordinary moments transformed into a matter of security concern. The business surrounding the Sussex identity had turned simple warmth into a liability. Behind the scenes of the now famous "Recollections May Vary" statement, a much stronger battle reportedly unfolded than the public ever saw. Early drafts from the palace were said to be softer, almost apologetic in tone, so what changed? Pressure from the younger generation, particularly William and Catherine, reportedly pushed for language with greater strength behind it. Their reasoning was straightforward. If the palace failed to answer clearly what was being broadcast to a global audience, lasting damage could follow, and in the end, the Queen agreed. She recognized that restraint was beginning to resemble weakness. By approving that phrase, she drew a line. Harry remained her grandson, but the truth in her mind remained her duty. The Platinum Jubilee ultimately provided perhaps the clearest image of everything she carried. From the balcony, the public saw a queen smiling and waving with the composure she had perfected across 70 years. But those closest to her saw a woman pushing through serious physical discomfort simply to stand before the people who had gathered to celebrate her. Harry and Meghan were there, present within the same building, yet held at a distance, and according to accounts from those working around the Queen that day, the atmosphere felt almost unbearable. Managing the expectations of an entire nation while navigating fresh family complications unfolding in real time required a level of emotional endurance that most people at her age or any age would have struggled to sustain. King Charles now carries a burden that in many ways mirrors the one she carried before him, caught between a father's love for his son and a king's duty to the institution he spent 70 years preparing to inherit. The opening years of his reign arrived alongside his own battle with cancer, accompanied by legal disputes, public allegations, and continuing turbulence. In many respects, the distress that once weighed on the Queen has simply transferred to him. And what remains unresolved, what Charles is believed to quietly live with, is the lingering question of what might have happened if Harry had chosen a different path, if he had remained, if he had embraced a role within the slimmer monarchy, if he had stood beside his brother rather than opposite him. It's a question without a clean answer, and perhaps that's exactly why it remains so difficult to let go of. Viewed from the distance of several years, the California dream appears far less dazzling than it may once have seemed. The revelations that initially felt earth-shaking no longer carry the same power to surprise, and the reality facing the brand is one every public figure eventually encounters. Attention moves on. And what the Sussexes may have lost in pursuing their own version of truth was something no Montecito gathering or celebrity circle could ever truly replace: the unconditional protection of one of the world's oldest and most enduring families. During her final years, the Queen quietly focused on strengthening the walls around those who remained. She worked to shield the institution from further damage and approached that responsibility with the same discipline she had brought to every duty throughout her life. Because the true tragedy of her final years wasn't death itself, it was that she spent them fighting a battle she never wanted to fight at all. Protecting the crown from the very grandson she had once watched grow up beneath its protection.